It's all about the hit. A Cheer Mom's Cozy Mystery. Book 5. Written and narrated by Lena Turner. Chapter 1. The parents' viewing room at the gym of my daughter's cheerleading team, the Aces of Cherry City, was full of activity as I waited for the start of practice. We were at the last practice before competing for the weekend, which would not only be the last cheer competition of the year, but the championship competition that would determine who won the entire season. The Aces of Cherry City were in first place coming into the weekend, but it didn't matter how well they had done all season. What mattered was how well they did at this final competition, because previous scores did not count and all teams would start from zero, essentially giving everyone a fair shot at the championship. "Abby, can you believe the season is almost over?" Stephanie, one of the other cheer moms and my friend, said. We were all sitting together as we typically did while watching our girls. Me, Stephanie, Jenny, and Diane. Prior to the season, I had been friendly with the cheer moms, but not friends, if you get what I'm saying. But some crazy events that we had experienced together over these last few months had brought a new depth to our relationship. We'd been through murders, a missing teen, a judging scandal. You name it. We had seen it. So where I previously sat, begrudgingly watching my daughter practice for 3 hours, I now welcomed the chance to socialize with the other cheer moms. I know. It's one of those things that seems like it's lasting forever when you are doing it. But then when it's over, it seems like it went fast, I said. The other women nodded their heads in agreement. Yes! Jenny pumped her fist in the air as we watched her daughter land her tumbling pass. She's been struggling all season to do that move and has been taking extra tumbling lessons. I am so happy to see they are finally paying off. She looked amazing out there. You would never know that she'd been struggling, I said. All our girls make this look really easy, which, if you ask me, is why cheerleading doesn't get nearly the respect it deserves, Diane said, with just a hint of bitterness to her tone. I totally understood her sentiment. Most people thought cheerleading was just jumping around on a football field, yelling a variation of "go, team, go," and shaking some pom-poms. Some cheerleading was just that, and those cheerleaders also deserved credit for what they did. But the world of competitive cheer was much different. The grueling practices, the girls flipping their bodies every which way on their tumbling passes, and the insane stunts made me happy Abby was a base and not the flyer. I didn't think I could stand to see her body flying through the air, hoping to get caught on the way down. Not that she was without injury. She had had 2 concussions and even had a few teeth knocked loose after getting kicked in the face when someone came down from a stunt. Competitive cheerleading was not a sport to be treated lightly. I had always known that, but this season, as I'd become more involved, I realized even more how rough it was. These girls were fierce athletes and were as tough as nails. Well, there is talk of cheerleading becoming an Olympic sport. Even if it never makes it that far, the fact that it's even being considered speaks volumes about where the sport is today in terms of recognition for the athletes, I said. What do you guys think of the new choreographer? Diane asked, changing the subject. I assumed she brought up the topic because the new choreographer, Jeremiah Oslo, was on the floor with our girls, gesticulating as he was explaining something to them. He's supposed to be the best choreographer in the business, Stephanie said. I heard that too, and I can't believe we got him for our gym, Diane said. Well, I heard he has a reputation for following the winners, and we've been winning all season, Stephanie said. I'm not sure I like his lack of loyalty, though. As long as we keep winning, it won't be an issue, Diane said. Jeremiah had been the coach and choreographer for the Kineville Cougars for the last 2 years, and they had held the #1 spot. They had fallen down in the standings this year, while the Aces of Cherry City had climbed to the #1 spot. So it did look as if he was fickle, wanting to work for whoever was winning. What I say is that we take all the knowledge we can from him, Not that I don't think our girls will win or be winners next year, but to have a choreographer of his caliber is truly a cheer blessing, Diane said. Speaking of the Kineville Cougars, I kind of feel bad for them, I said, thinking about how heartbroken I would be for Ashley and her team if they were having a bad year. Why? Jenny asked me. Well, they lost their best coach, and you know how hard it had to be on the girls. They've done horrible this year, not even placing in the top 5. I wouldn't feel so bad if they hadn't lost their coach. I guess you have a point, Jenny said, glancing at the floor, not wanting to meet my eyes. To be honest, Diane said, I'm surprised they've done as well as they have. I'm not sure Taylor could bounce back and keep cheering if something happened to Coach Becky. Yeah, Ashley either. There have been so many negative things that happened this season. I'm just hoping this competition goes off without a hitch, especially since it's in our own town. Cherry City was a small town, but was centrally located in southern Illinois. A few years ago, the city had had the good fortune to get a state-of-the-art convention center built. This year we lucked out, and the final championship cheer competition was to be held there. I was so happy, because while I enjoyed spending time with Ashley, traveling out of town to all the competitions was tiring. So at least this was close. The ladies and I sat in silence, watching the girls, and it thrilled me to see their practice going so well. Then suddenly Jeremiah, who was on the edge of the mat, pacing back and forth, his eagle eye calling out corrections to the girls, let out a wail, clutched his chest, and collapsed. He thrashed around on the gym floor for what seemed like forever, but was only a few seconds. And then he stopped, and all was quiet. The moms and I looked at one another before we all jumped up, rushing onto the floor to see if we could help. When we reached Jeremiah, the girls were all huddled around while the on-duty trainer was frantically doing chest compressions. I whipped out my phone and called 911. As soon as I hung up, Evelyn, the trainer, looked up at us. I can't get him to start breathing, she cried, continuing to pump on his chest and administer CPR, but she finally turned to us, tears streaming down her face. I think he's dead. Chapter 2. I looked on, horrified that the girls may have just witnessed the death of their new choreographer, and even if he wasn't dead, watching him fall to the ground and thrash in what looked like considerable agony was bad enough. And so much for thinking this competition would go off without a hitch, and I couldn't help but feel a little guilty that maybe I had jinxed it somehow, and it seemed like an eternity. But only a few minutes passed until the police and paramedics rushed into the room pushing a gurney as they hurried to us. And we were lucky we were only 5 minutes from the nearest station. And the paramedics quickly took over for Evelyn and went to work on Jeremiah. And after a few minutes, they shook their heads and stopped their own attempts at reviving him, and they started to clean up all the medical supplies and trash scattered around him, and the 2 uniformed officers stood off to the side until a middle-aged man with coroner on his jacket walked up to them. And Jenny whispered to us that it seemed like Evelyn was right, and I shook my head, really wishing that wasn't the case, and Diane said, "Well, Abby, it looks like you have another murder to solve." And I just looked at the women and then over to the girls, hoping no one had heard her, and I didn't like tossing the word murder around within earshot of the girls. And I said in a hushed tone, "This is the last thing I wanted," and Diane said, matching my whisper and gesturing to the body on the floor, "Well, of course it is, but it happened. And it happened at our gym, so we need to figure out who is behind this." And I said, "We don't even know if this is anything more than natural causes." Though I realized the likelihood of a 28-year-old seemingly healthy man dropping dead at a practice where he wasn't actually doing anything to exert energy was pretty slim. And I said, "I think we'd better check on our girls now and worry about what happens later." And we walked over to where the team stood shuffling uneasily with Martha, the owner of the Cherry City Aces team and gym, and we all hugged our respective daughters and watched the coroner look at Jeremiah's body as Evelyn stood by, her face blotchy and red, and Ashley cried, as did most of the other girls. And I just hated that they had to witness this. And Ashley asked me tearfully, "Mom, isn't that Anthony?" and pointed to the double doors that separated the gym floor from the administration area. And I looked over to see she was right, and Anthony Barrett, my boyfriend, we had recently made it official, was a detective with the Cherry City Police Department, and I had met him because of an unfortunate incident when the Kineville Cougars coach was killed. And at our first meeting, I had been surprised to hear he had been to Scoop's, my ice cream store, and knew who I was. And we developed a friendship over ice cream initially, and Ashley's father had passed away several years ago. And while I had dated occasionally, Anthony had been my first serious relationship of any kind, and I had been apprehensive about getting involved with someone. But he was an amazing guy, and Ashley had been very supportive of the relationship, and he saw us and quickened his steps, heading our way, and he said, "Are you guys okay?" Looking us up and down as if to see if we had been injured, and the frantic look on his face touched me. And not that I wanted him to be worried about us, but it was nice to know he cared, and I said, "We're fine." And he turned to look at Ashley, who just burst into tears again. And I took her into my arms, looking at Anthony over her head, and his eyes locked onto mine and conveyed so much. And his gaze filled me with warmth and understanding that what she'd witnessed would be hard to deal with, and he said, "I hate to leave you guys, but I actually caught this case and need to do my job. I have to talk to Martha and the other coaches first. After that, I'll need to talk to you and Ashley, and of course, the rest of the moms and their daughters." And I knew he had to do his job. And frankly, I was glad he was the one here. But what I didn't know was why he was here. Unless someone already thought Jeremiah's collapse was murder, and Anthony started to walk away, I grabbed his arm and he turned back to face me, eyebrows raised questioningly, and I whispered, "Why are you here?" And he said, "I'll tell you later." And I didn't really like the sound of that, but respected the fact that now was not the time or place to discuss whatever he knew. And not to mention, my priority was definitely Ashley, and I couldn't help but think of how long it took her to get over her dad's death. And while this wasn't the same, I didn't have to be a psychologist to know that Jeremiah's death could open up bad memories from that time, and I said, "Honey, as soon as we give our statements to Anthony, we're going to go home. Okay?" And she nodded, sniffling to hold back her tears, and I took her into the hallway so she didn't have to watch the coroner and Anthony with Jeremiah's body, and while outwardly showing a calm and collected demeanor for Ashley's sake, inside I felt a surge of anger, and if someone had indeed killed Jeremiah, they needed to pay for what they did and what they were putting our girls through. Chapter 3. By 8 p.m., Ashley and I had watched a movie and eaten her favorite pizza, and she seemed to be doing okay, but I worried and planned to keep my eye on her, and the other moms and I had texted all night about our daughters, worrying about their mental health and how they would do at the competition that started in 2 days. Not that we cared as much about that, but we all knew how important it was to them, and if it were up to me, I wouldn't even have the team compete. And before we'd left the gym that afternoon, Martha had asked the girls if they would prefer to pull out of the competition or go forward, and to no great surprise, the girls had unanimously decided to go forward because they were fierce competitors, and after the girls said they wanted to continue, Martha made arrangements for them to practice in another space if the police weren't done with the gym, and Ashley said goodnight and headed off to her room after our movie, and I sat on the back deck, my favorite place in the house, holding a cup of hot tea in my hands with a blanket over my legs since it was chilly, and my phone buzzed in my lap with a text from Anthony saying he was on his way over, and I texted back, telling him he would find me on the back deck, and when he got here, I would see if he wanted anything to drink or even eat, as I had found when he was busy working on a case. Food often took a back seat, a concept I didn't even understand because food always seemed to be on my mind, and even though the weather had grown chilly, it was nice to sit out in the fresh air and watch the sun's final descent. And I was so lost in thought that when Anthony said, "Hey there," from behind me, I startled, and I turned my head to watch him walk around and take a seat in the chair opposite mine, and his eyes were dark and pensive, and I felt that didn't bode well for what he might be about to tell me, and I said, "Can I get you anything?" "There's leftover pizza, but I warn you it's ham and pineapple, which Ashley likes." "Coffee? Tea? You have a couple of beers left from a few weeks ago." Offering him all the choices, and he said, "No, I'm fine. I had a late lunch, so I'm good right now, but thank you." And he was always polite, which was one of the many things I loved about him. And I asked, "So what happened?" And he rubbed his hands over his face a couple of times, as if trying to wake himself up before speaking, and said, "My gut and preliminary evidence points to murder." And I said, well, I kind of figured that when you showed up at the gym. But what I don't understand is how did anyone know that so quickly? And he said they didn't. But anytime the EMTs are dispatched, a patrol unit shows up too. In this case, the uniforms called me and the coroner in. And I frowned and said, it seems kind of odd. And he said, which part? That they called me right away, or the fact that your choreographer was killed? And I said, honestly, both. And I couldn't believe I was staying so calm because this was really freaking me out. But I had to keep a level head for Ashley, and he said, well, I have a simple answer to your first question. The police chief is really cracking down on crime. You know how we had a rash of residential burglaries the last few months? And I nodded, because Cherry City was a relatively small town with a population of around 19,000 and really very little crime until recently with the residential burglaries. And he said, the patrol officers are under orders to contact a detective if they suspect anything might be a crime, even more than usual. They err on the side of caution so they don't get in trouble later. And he took a deep breath and went on. As far as your other question, I don't know much yet. All I can say is Ashley and those poor girls on the team have had such a rough year already. To have this happen right in front of them. And he stopped and just shook his head. And then asked, how is Ashley doing? And I could hear the sympathy in his voice. And him caring so much about my daughter just made my heart swell. And I said, she's actually doing better than I expected. Though I didn't know what I expected, and I added, I guess I'm more afraid that this could bring back some of those old feelings from when Mike died, and I just hate that for her. And I could see the sadness in his eyes as he said, I thought of that too. It just makes me so angry that someone would do this in front of a bunch of young girls. And his voice had an edge to it, and his jaw clenched. And I could tell this time he took the offense a little more personally, and I said, well, Martha gave the girls an option to drop out of the competition this weekend, and they all said no. And at that, he cracked a slight smile, because he had been around Ashley enough to know how dedicated she was to cheer, and he said, how does that not surprise me, with a small grin? And I nodded and smiled for the first time since Jeremiah had collapsed, and said, I know, right? I tell you from time to time, I think my 13-year-old daughter is much stronger than I am, definitely stronger than I give her credit for. So how was Jeremiah killed? And he said, we're still waiting for the final determination, but the paramedics smelled a funky odor on his breath, and that's what tipped them off to let the uniforms know to call me in. And I said, funky odor? Questioningly, and he said, I know, sounds strange. But I guess it's their job to know what's normal and what's not in a dead body. And I could tell by his rigid posture he was being vague on purpose, and I cringed a little as he said that and asked, did you get any leads when you talked to people? And he gave me a pointed look, and I knew what he was thinking, because I had played a part in solving a few murders that had happened at some competitions this season, and it wasn't something he liked me to be involved in. And I said, listen, this happened in front of my daughter, so I have a vested interest now. And he sighed and said, no, nothing. I'm hoping that once the autopsy is complete, which should be soon, because there's a rush on it, and when the crime lab has had time to analyze his blood, I will have more to go on. And even though I knew establishing cause of death took time, I was definitely impatient, and I wanted Anthony to catch the person who had committed this crime and caused trauma to an entire gym full of teenagers, and I wanted it now. Chapter 4. This is more exciting than I thought, I said to Ashley as we checked into the hotel next to the convention center. And normally, when we had a competition within an hour of our home, I didn't go to the expense of staying in a hotel. But the girls on the team had begged us moms to stay at the hotel so everyone could hang out when they were competing. Which made sense. And since it was the last competition, we had agreed, well, all except one, Casey Hudgens and her daughter Ariel, was a delight. But Casey despised the sport and let no one forget it, and it made me feel for Ariel because I knew this sport, like all sports, needed parental support. However, we had put it to a vote, and Casey was the only holdout, and listening to Casey complain would be a small price to pay for her daughter to be included, and Ashley said, I have to agree with you on that, Mom. We've never checked into a competition hotel with its entire lobby decked out in cheer stuff. This is so cool. And she was right. And I wasn't even a cheerleader, and I thought it was cool that they had somehow gotten photos from all the competitions this season, probably from the professional company who did action shots, and there were displays set up all over the lobby showcasing different competitions. And added to that were a bunch of twinkly lights that I was pretty sure wasn't the norm, which gave off the illusion of sparkles. And the one thing that was never in short supply in cheer competition was sparkle. And the line to get checked in went quickly. And soon we hauled our suitcases up to our room, and we had packed much lighter than normal, knowing that if something was forgotten, I could run home. So we were able to handle our load without a trolley, and we had no sooner brought our suitcases into the room when Ashley turned to me and said she was leaving to meet the other girls. And I said, "Meet where?" And she said, "We're going to the lobby to look at all the displays, and then the food court in the mall connected to the convention center. Then we can all get ready together for tonight's performance." And that was another nice thing about our convention center, because they had built it in the middle of an area outside of town next to the mall and a bunch of hotels, and then they had connected the 3 hotels by skywalks to the convention center, though I wondered, with the way traditional shopping malls were losing out to online retailers, what they would do if shopping malls became obsolete. And I asked, did all the other cheer moms agree to this? And she said, "Yes, Mom," in that teenage way designed to make you feel like you are asking the stupidest question on earth. And I raised my eyebrows and looked at her pointedly, and she said, "Okay, fine. Everyone but Ariel's mom. If she told her mom, she would never let her go." And I said, "I don't like that, Ashley. I realize her mom can be a bit of a pain, but it's not okay to be unaware of where your kid is. I need your word that before you guys go, Ariel will tell her mom." And Ashley rolled her eyes before responding, "Fine. But if she has to stay behind, it will be all your fault." And I said, "I'll take the heat." Because while I would feel bad if Casey didn't let Ariel go, there was no way, as a parent, I could condone knowing that she had not asked her mom's permission, and with Ashley gone and having her own plans for dinner, I texted my cheer mom group, asking them where they wanted to meet for dinner, and none of us had any illusions that the girls might want to actually spend time with us. And we had already made plans to eat at one of the many restaurants around the convention center, and it didn't take long before I got unanimous responses that they wanted to meet at the Mexican restaurant across the street, called Mr. Chips, and salsa, and not that it was any kind of fancy place, but they had great tasting food and huge portions for a good price. And I was never one to turn down Mexican food, and an hour later, the ladies and I were at Mr. Chips and salsa. And we had even asked Grumpy Casey to come with us, and she'd said no. And how anyone could turn down Mexican food, I didn't know. And after the waitress took our orders, the conversation turned in a direction I hadn't expected it to go the minute we all sat down. Though I wasn't sure why I was surprised, and Diane said in a joking tone, "Have you been holding out on us?" And I said, "Holding out on what?" Teasing, realizing by the expectation on their faces what they were referring to, and Stephanie said, "Don't play hard to get, Abby. We know you've got to know something about what happened to Jeremiah." And I finished swallowing the chip in my mouth before speaking, and I almost felt like drawing the suspense out longer now that I noticed their impatience. Because Anthony had called me this morning and filled me in, and I said, "I can tell you what I know, but you can't say anything to anyone, or Anthony could really get in trouble." And I looked around the table, and everyone nodded as they stared at me, and I glanced around at the surrounding tables, but everyone was too busy in their own conversations to pay any attention to what I said. And I said, "Anthony called me this morning, trying to keep my voice low. He told me they sent the toxicology to the county lab to get results back a lot faster, and Jeremiah was poisoned with a high dose of ephedra." And I watched as all the women broke into horrified looks, and I totally understood where they were coming from, because I felt the same way when Anthony had told me. And knowing this had happened at our gym to someone we actually knew and that our girls knew just made the whole scenario seem so much worse. And Stephanie asked, "Do they know how he was poisoned?" And I said, "Apparently, they also found residue of this poison in his sports bottle." And Stephanie said, "Oh my goodness. What if one of our girls had taken a drink out of it?" her eyes wide as she glanced around the table, and Diane said, "That's disgusting on many levels." And Stephanie looked at her crossly and said, "Of course it is. And I'm sure it never happens with a coach, but you know our girls do it all the time with one another." And Diane asked, "Who could have put it in there?" And I said, "Your guess is as good as mine. Anthony says they don't have any leads. Everyone he spoke to said Jeremiah always carried a sports bottle that he brought from home. So it's anyone's guess who may have had access to it." And I grabbed a couple more chips and slid them through the salsa because if I wasn't careful, I wouldn't have any room for the fajitas I had ordered, which was a common issue with me when I ate in Mexican restaurants. Because who could just have one or two chips? Though I had to admit the conversation was ruining my appetite just a little, and I hated thinking about a murder happening right under our noses. And Diane said, "Well, Abby, I guess you have your work cut out for you." And I looked at her with what I hoped was a "what the heck are you talking about" expression, and I said, "What are you guys talking about?" to make sure they got the point, and Diane said, "Don't play dumb with us, Abby. This is our last competition, and the 5th competition this season where something horrible has happened. Now we have another murder, one in our town, in the gym our girls go to someone they care about and respect, and you sit there and act like you shouldn't investigate and see who it is that killed Jeremiah." And while I'd had a hand in solving a few crimes recently, it was a little different now because Anthony was the detective on the case. And I knew he would not want me investigating, nor would he accept my help because of laws and such, but I had to admit, I desperately wanted to find the killer, and maybe there wasn't much harm in poking around just a little. Chapter 5. It was 8:30 p.m., and the crowd was cheering loudly in the stands for the teams competing. And the other moms and I were waiting for our girls to take the floor, and while it seemed insane to be waiting to compete at this time of night, it wasn't unusual, and although it made for a long day, I preferred night performances to the ones at the crack of dawn, even if I did feel like I was about to fall into a fajita coma. And Diane said, "I have to admit it, ladies, I'm really nervous about the girls' performance. I know their heart is in the right place. I know they really want to do a great job and are dedicating this competition to Jeremiah, but they looked shaky in warm-ups." And I turned my head to look at her, her last statement catching me off guard, and Jenny and Stephanie exchanged glances before looking at me in agreement, and Casey grumbled, arms crossed, "We shouldn't even be here." And Diane reminded her, "The girls voted, and Casey said they're kids. Why did we let kids make that decision?" And I asked, "How do you know how they did in warm-ups?" Ignoring Casey, because I didn't need her negativity, and parents weren't allowed backstage, so I was dying to know how Diane had come about this bit of information. And Diane said, "Brianna took a video and sent it to me. Want to see it?" And Brianna was the choreographer taking over for Jeremiah, and it shocked me that she would defy Martha's decree that any warm-ups behind stage were strictly to stay within the team. Because years ago she had explained her rationale, that she didn't want any of the girls to worry more about what their parents might say about their performance warm-ups than their teammates. And I had to admit Martha had a point. Because some of these cheer moms really lived vicariously through their kids, and I had seen more than one parent yell at her daughter for missing a skill at the gym, which I thought was insane because my love for my daughter didn't hinge on how well she cheered, and Diane got in the middle of us and pulled the video up on her phone, and as we watched, I thought Diane had been right. And the girls looked very shaky in their stunts, and even some of the skills they could normally do in their sleep didn't have the same clean look that they usually had. And we continued to watch the video and all gasped when it came to the final pyramid, and the top flyer fell, and Evelyn ran over to see if she was okay before the video abruptly ended, and Diane said, eyes wide, "I did not know it would be that bad," and Jenny chided, "Diane?" And Diane said, "What? I'm just being honest." Listen, I would have been the first to support Taylor if she hadn't wanted to compete in this competition, and I certainly wouldn't say anything to their faces, but that was the worst routine I've seen them do all year, and she wasn't wrong. And my nervousness for the girls who were about to come out and compete grew, and a voice from behind us said, "See? This is why I can't believe we are still here at this competition after what happened earlier this week," and we all startled at the obvious intrusion. And of course, it was Casey complaining again. And I made myself refrain from sighing out loud because she was the last person of all the moms whom I would want to see this video, and I wouldn't put it past her to berate her daughter, since I had witnessed her nasty behavior more than once. And Diane snapped, surprising me. "Oh, Casey, you just don't want to be here regardless of the circumstances." And I could tell by the way Stephanie and Jenny's eyes went wide that they felt the same way I did, because there was no love lost between the two. And Casey wasn't close to any of the moms, but Diane was the team mom, and it was out of character for her to say anything negative. And Casey must have thought so too, because she shut her mouth and walked away, and I waited a few seconds for her to be out of earshot before I said anything to Diane, and I asked, "What was that all about?" And Diane said, "She had that coming. She's always so negative about everything, Cheer, and I would hate for Ariel not to be on the team, but I often wonder why her mom has even let her continue, when it's clear how much she hates the sport." And I said, "You know, that is a good point. I've often wondered about that too. I'm sure she just wants her daughter to be happy." And Jenny said, "I guess. But she's always so unhappy when it comes to anything Cheer. How can it not rob Ariel of some of her happiness in the sport?" And we all thought about that for a moment, and I said, "Who cares about Casey? They just called our girls on deck. Let's just focus on them having a clean routine." And when they called the Aces of Cherry City, we all headed to the parents' viewing. Chapter 6. As expected, the girls did not end in first place in points, instead coming in third, but they were only a little less than a point behind the teams they had been beating all season. And Ashley told me the girls weren't too worried nor upset about the performance, saying they were happy to have the first one out of the way and felt they would do much better tomorrow, and I was happy with her attitude and that of the other girls. And she relayed all this information in a rush as she changed from her cheer uniform into casual clothes before leaving to join her friends. And they were going to spend the night in someone's room, and I had offered our room as the meeting spot. But one girl on the team was from a very wealthy family, and they always rented a suite, which was where the girls typically hung out, and it wasn't necessarily in my budget to get a suite, but I was grateful that the girls had a place that they liked to get together, and they liked to be with each other so much that the relationships Ashley had built with the girls over the years, to me, were one huge benefit of being on a cheer team, because she had made some very good friends, and not everyone on the team was best friends with each other, though, because as was normal with teen girls, there were a lot of cliques. But at the end of the day, everyone was nice to each other. And when it was competition time, they really stuck together, and it was late, a little after 10, and if I had been at home, I would probably be in my pajamas reading a book. And I wasn't at all tired, so I decided to do some digging into Jeremiah's background and see what I could find out, and I took my laptop to bed, propping the extra pillows behind my back in an attempt to look after my posture. And I typed Jeremiah Oslo cheer in the search bar and got more hits than I expected, and the articles were mostly accolades from his college days and from his coaching, and then of course articles by our local paper on the murder business, and some of the cheer news outlets had covered it as well, and one of the pictures from his college cheer days caught my eye, and I zoomed in, and a familiar face looked back at me. Evelyn, the Aces trainer. And cheer really was a small world. And I couldn't find anything that put Jeremiah in a less than a stellar light, which wasn't completely surprising because he was young and in demand, and everyone at the gym in the know said we were lucky to get him, and nothing else popped up in my search that was helpful. And I closed the lid on my laptop and left it on my lap to think. And maybe I was barking up the wrong tree, and I wondered if his murder could be completely random with no connection to cheer, and I looked at my phone. And even though it was close to 11 by now, I knew Anthony would still be up, and I sent him a text asking if he had a minute to talk, and he assured me he did, so I called him, and he asked, "Is everything okay?" And I said, "Yes, everything's fine." And he asked, "How did Ashley's team do?" And I gave him the rundown on the team's performance, and it made me happy that he had asked, and I hadn't texted him earlier to avoid bothering him when I knew he was busy, though I was bothering him now, I thought with a chuckle, and he said, "What's funny?" And I said, "Nothing. I'm just over here making myself laugh." And he said, "So did you just call to tell me how she did?" And I said, "No. But I really appreciate you asking," and added, "I called to see if you had any leads yet on Jeremiah's murder." And he said, "No. Why does it make me feel nervous that you're asking me this question?" And I said, "I know you don't like me meddling, as you put it, infinitely. That term always makes me think of the meddling kids from Scooby-Doo, and he said yes, because they shouldn't have been meddling. And I said, but it was always the villain that said that, after the gang caught him. And he said, touché. And I said, well, I am meddling. I can't help it. He was my daughter's choreographer, so this is personal. And Anthony sighed and said, I guess I'm not going to convince you to leave this to me. And I shook my head, even though he couldn't see it, and said, no, you're not. But I promise not to take any unnecessary risks. And he groaned and said, I don't enjoy thinking of you taking any risks at all. And I said, that's sweet, and frankly, me neither, but let's just agree I will try to be careful. Do you think this could have been just a random murder? Or do you think it's related to cheer? And he said, I hate to say this, but based on what we know so far, I'm convinced it's not random. There was poison residue in his sports bottle. People who want to randomly kill with poison usually do so by putting poison in a common food area that anyone can come across. Someone had to have deliberately put it in his sports bottle because he was the specific target, not a random victim. We found no evidence of ephedra at his apartment, and he lives alone. We also checked his car and his spot at the gym. Low doses of ephedra can be used in some instances, but the amount he had in his system was well beyond what anyone might use in a therapeutic application. And it didn't take a seasoned detective to figure out what that meant. And I said, so someone deliberately did this, which means someone wanted him dead. From what I've seen, he's got a squeaky clean record with tons of cheer accolades. And Anthony said matter-of-factly, you've already been investigating? And I said, just on Google. That hardly counts. And he said, well, you're not wrong. And based on that information, it's likely someone in the cheer world wanted to hurt the aces of Cherry City enough to kill him. It's still early in our investigation, but we can't find any link to a personal attack on him. And I said nothing for a minute, letting that soak in. And I got chills thinking of someone deliberately going to such lengths just for a sporting event. And though it wasn't the first time this season I'd had those thoughts, it was the first time that someone had targeted my daughter's team. And as scary as that was, I knew I had to do something. And he asked, are you still there? And I said, I'm here, just taking it all in. And he said, I know. I realize I've only been in your and Ashley's life for a short time, but I'm taking this much more personally too. And it made me feel better knowing that Anthony was on the case. Chapter 7. I got off the phone with Anthony and still wasn't tired, and I knew if I didn't go to bed soon, I would pay for it tomorrow, but sitting here thinking wasn't going to make me more tired, and instead, it would just keep me up, and what would help me sleep was information. And the bar in the hotel lobby would be full of cheer parents, and while it wasn't my normal scene, I wasn't going to go down there to party, and I wanted to see if I could find out more information about Jeremiah, and I had both heard through the grapevine and witnessed occasionally that the moms from the Kinville Cougars were a wilder bunch than the aces of Cherry City moms. And they often stayed up to the wee hours of the night, and more power to them, but I just didn't have that kind of stamina between running my business and taking care of Ashley, and I thought for a minute about changing my clothes and decided it wasn't worth the effort, and I wasn't trying to pick someone up, and I didn't care how I looked. And I grabbed the key card, stuffing it in my purse while grabbing my phone and heading out the door. And we were staying on the 15th floor this time, so the elevator took forever to get down to the 3rd floor. And the elevator doors finally opened, and I stepped out into a common area right in front of the bar, and tables and chairs were spilling out in the hallway, full of people chattering, and I imagined they needed this extra space due to the amount of people attending this competition and the other conventions. And I went in and looked around as I walked up to the bar, and when I reached the bartender, I ordered a Diet Coke. And I didn't want to walk around empty-handed, and once I had my drink fancied up with a wedge of lime the bartender added, I meandered my way through the crowds of people, looking for someone from the Kineville Cougars I might recognize. And I mean, it would be awesome if I somehow magically overheard someone admitting they'd killed Jeremiah. But I wasn't really holding my breath for that one, and I made 2 loops around the bar, and slightly defeated, I thought about taking one more look in the seating area outside the bar, and if I still had no luck, giving up and going back to my room. And I was finally beginning to feel a little tired when I spotted someone who looked familiar. And her name was Charlene. And I had met her once with Rhonda, who had been a cheer mom until she went too far and ended up in prison. And Charlene stood with a couple of other moms, and I made my way over to them. And even though I didn't really know them, I didn't feel that out of place, coming right up to their group and inserting myself in the conversation. And our kids might be on different teams, but we were all cheer moms, and there was an undercurrent of camaraderie. And I said, "Hi, may I join you?" And the women turned to me and smiled warmly. "And of course," one of them said. And Charlene tilted her head and looked at me quizzically and said, "You're Abby from the Aces of Cherry City, aren't you?" And I said, "I am. It's Charlene, right?" And she said, "Yes. And this is Evie and Annie," pointing to the woman who had greeted me and the blonde next to her. And she said, "I don't think I've ever seen you out at the bar at one of these competitions." Not unkindly, and she was right. And I said, "You're right. I'm not usually up this late, but I just couldn't sleep." And Charlene put her hand on my arm and said, "I heard, and I feel so bad." And the looks of sympathy on their faces when Charlene mentioned I was from the Aces of Cherry City made it very clear that they had heard what had happened, though I wasn't surprised. And the Kindville Cougars were from the next town over, our closest competitor geographically until this year, when their best coach had been murdered and the team had slid in the rankings after that happened. And one of the moms in the group said, "I am so sorry. I can't believe your girls are still competing. I didn't think the Cougars should go on after Brian was killed, but I got outvoted." And I went through my spiel of how the girls wanted to do it in Jeremiah's memory and had taken a vote and all that stuff. And I listened to them talk about how the murder of Coach Brian had really had a hard impact on all their daughters, which was exactly what I was hoping wouldn't happen to Ashley and her teammates. And I said, "That's how it was for our girls. They wanted the show to go on, so to speak." And Charlene said, "Do they know what happened?" "I haven't really kept up on the news." And I said, "Well, from the gossip I heard, I don't think it was random. It probably has something to do with cheer." And the ladies looked properly horrified after I told them this, and I wasn't about to share my inside source, but wanted to give them enough information that they would be willing to share some in return. And Evie said, "I don't know if I'm going to let Connie cheer next year. I kind of wish I had her quit after what happened to Brian." And Annie replied, "I know. This year has been horrible. I can't believe all the bad things that have happened." And Charlene said, "And you've been right in the thick of most of them, haven't you?" As a statement, not a question. And I looked at her, not exactly sure where she was going with that. And Evie said, Right, you're the one who caught Brian's killer." And for some reason, she made it sound like a bad thing. And I said, "I just got lucky. I'm glad I saw you guys. I now know firsthand how it feels to have something so horrible happen at a gym with someone your girls are close to. I feel bad I didn't do more when Brian was murdered." And Charlene said again with a bite to her tone, "What could you have done?" And the other moms nodded their heads in support of her like bobblehead dolls. And I said, "Honestly, Charlene, I don't know. I guess my point is, I'm really sorry for what all of you and your girls went through this year." And the other moms murmured their thanks. But Charlene didn't really say much, and her lips were pressed together in a thin line, and she wasn't happy. But I wasn't sure what I did to cause her ire. And one mom said, "Charlene, you knew Jeremiah pretty well. Better than the rest of us." And Charlene snapped at her, "Not really." And Charlene's attitude surprised me, and I wasn't sure what her problem was, but maybe she was just having a bad day. And Evie said, "You're being modest, Charlene. I know Hazel had a lot of private lessons with him. Surely you know more about him than the rest of us." And I tried to contain my excitement, because I wouldn't have known this on my own, and Charlene certainly wasn't forthcoming, and I could tell she wasn't happy that this was being brought up by the frown on her face, but I hoped she would answer. And Charlene said, "I don't know what you're getting at. Do you think I had something to do with Jeremiah's murder? Why? So the Aces of Cherry City wouldn't win? It's not like their loss is going to help our chances to win. We're not even in the top 10. And I was really shocked that Charlene had jumped to that conclusion so fast, and I hadn't thought until right then that she would have had anything to do with Jeremiah's murder, though she sure didn't like the fact that her relationship with him was being questioned. And I made a mental note to ask Anthony if the police had talked to her, and I didn't think it would be a good idea to ask her myself. at least not right now, but something was going on with her, and Annie said, "Didn't you know him before he became the Kineville Cougars choreographer? I thought you were the one that recruited him for us." And my interest really perked up at that, and I stood staring at Charlene, fascinated by what she was going to say, and Charlene said, "Yes, I did, but I didn't know him that well. Listen, I need to go." And she put her drink down and walked off, leaving the other ladies and me to stare after her, and Evie said with a slight smirk, "Typical Charlene. She's fine with gossiping, but never likes to be the center of it." And I said, "What do you mean?" And Evie said, "There was a huge rumor when Jeremiah came to work with the Kineville Cougars that he was the reason for Charlene and her husband's split. If you get my drift." And she gave me a meaningful look, and I wondered if that meant Charlene and Jeremiah had a past relationship and whether Charlene could have killed him as a scorned lover, and I said, "Really? You think it was real, not just gossip?" I know how gossip takes on a life of its own, in disbelief, thinking of their age difference. And Evie said, "We all believed it, even though Charlene would never admit it. One mom said she saw them kissing in her car one time. And unless someone made that up, that sounded like proof to me. And I realized I needed to get Charlene alone so I could get her to talk to me. And I knew I wouldn't get my wish tonight, and I knew it probably wouldn't happen unless I brought Diane with me, because she knew the Kineville Cougar moms much better than I did. And I made a mental note to text her first thing in the morning." Chapter 8. When my alarm went off at 7, I groaned and I'd got back to my room at about 1 o'clock, but then tossed and turned for what seemed like hours, and right now I felt exhausted. That kind of tired when your eyes are gritty and grainy. And I rubbed the sleep from my eyes and grabbed my phone. And now that I could see, I found a good morning text from Anthony that brought a smile to my face, and I planned to ask him about Charlene after I had a chance to talk to her one-on-one. And speaking of that, I shot off a text to Diane, asking if she wanted to meet for coffee, and while I waited for her to respond, I sent a good morning text to Ashley, even though I knew there was no way she would be up yet. And they didn't compete until the afternoon, so my guess was, as with most girls that age, they had stayed up way too late and would sleep in today, and I finally made it out of bed to the bathroom where I washed my face when my phone vibrated, and squinting through watery eyes, I saw Diane had responded, and she said, "Sure, I'm already up and ready. 10 minutes?" And I groaned before texting back, "Better make it 20. Long night, long story." And while waiting for her response, I turned on the shower water, testing the temperature with my hand, and I waited for it to get warm enough to jump in so I could shower quickly without washing my hair, because that's what messy buns are for. And 18 minutes later, I was as put together as I expected to get and headed down to meet Diane, super grateful that soon I would have a coffee in hand, and maybe, once the caffeine took effect, I would start feeling better. And I walked into the coffee shop and found Diane already sitting there. And when she noticed me, she held up a coffee, showing it was for me, and I rushed over and slid into the seat across from her, accepting the coffee gratefully and inhaling the wonderful aroma before taking a big sip. And I knew it was too soon for it to take effect, but I already felt more alert, in anticipation of the magical caffeine that would soon work a miracle. And Diane said, "Don't take this the wrong way, but you look tired." And I wondered exactly what way I was supposed to take it, but it wasn't like she was wrong. And I said, "I went to the bar last night and didn't get back until about 1, then couldn't sleep." And I took another drink of my coffee, and Diane's mouth gaped open, probably at the mention of me going to the bar, since she knew that wasn't normally my thing. And she said, "Whatever made you decide to do that?" And I said, "I thought maybe I would run into some of the moms from the Kineville Cougars and see what they might know about Jeremiah." And Diane nodded her head and said, "Good thinking. Did you find out anything?" And I took another sip of the coffee, hesitating over what I should divulge before talking to Anthony, and she said, "You look worried. What's wrong? Spit it out." And I said, "I ran into Charlene, Evie, and Annie. I know you know Charlene, but what about the other two?" And she said, "Like you said, I know Charlene, and Evie a little too." "Why? Did something happen?" And I said, "Kind of. We got onto the subject of what had happened to Jeremiah, and Evie questioned Charlene about what she knew of Jeremiah's personal life. Charlene got very upset and walked out. Then the women told me that the rumor was Charlene had had a personal relationship with Jeremiah, and that's why she got divorced. And I stopped talking to take in the shocked look on Diane's face, and I said, I know, crazy, right? But the women seemed convinced that the rumor was true, even though they said Charlene denied it. And Diane said, of course she would deny it. She didn't want her kids to find out. And I did a double take at her reaction and said, you knew? And she slowly nodded, and she said, Evie told me way back, well, you know, she showed me text messages Charlene sent her. Apparently Evie saw them together, and Charlene was afraid she would tell. And I said, have you told this to the police? And she said, no. They haven't talked to me, and I guess I didn't think it mattered. Do you think it matters? And I said, it might. And she said, you're not mad, are you? And I said, of course not. The police didn't come talk to you, and I can totally understand. And Diane nodded and said, that was a horrible time in her life from what I heard. One I'm sure she doesn't want to be reminded of, so I didn't want to be the person to bring it back up. And I said, do you think she could have had anything to do with his murder? And Diane gasped. Covering her mouth with her hand, she said, I guess anything is possible. This was a long time ago. Why would she kill him now? And I said, who knows? There are a lot of Lifetime movies that show how crazy people can be. And Diane said, do you want me to text her and see if she'll talk to us? I think she might be more inclined to answer a text than if I called her. And I said, I'd love that. I really want to know more about him. It seems like she might be the person to give us that information if she's willing to talk. And Diane said, I can try. And pulled out her phone, scrolling through her contacts until finally clicking on a number, and her thumbs flew over the keyboard. And she said, okay, now we wait. And as we waited, both fidgeting nervously, I mentally crossed my fingers, hoping she would reply, and finally Diane's phone buzzed in her hand, and she looked down at her phone, and then smiled and said, she said she'd meet us in a few minutes. Well, actually me. I didn't tell her what it was about, or that you were here. And I hoped that when she showed up, she wouldn't see me and leave, because I had a few questions for her. Chapter 9. About 10 minutes passed before Charlene walked into the coffee shop, and I felt my nervousness grow because I knew how hostile she'd been the night before on the topic of Jeremiah. And I wasn't sure how she would react once she found out Diane had essentially lured her down here to talk to me about the same thing she'd already tried to avoid. And I saw her looking around the room, and then she spotted us. And she did a double take, but recovered quickly, and continued to our table. And maybe this was a good sign. And Charlene slumped in the chair across from us, and it didn't look like she'd gotten much sleep, judging by the dark circles under her eyes. And Diane asked, is everything okay? And Charlene sighed and said, not really. And Diane asked, what's wrong? And Charlene said, all the stuff with Jeremiah. I'm sorry he's dead. I can't believe the news is saying he was murdered, but our affair was over a long time ago, and I don't like this being brought back up, especially because of the kid. And I felt bad for her, because even if she'd made a mistake, it was in the past, and I could completely understand why she wouldn't want to rehash her divorce and have to have her kids relive the experience all over again. And I asked in a gentle voice, do you have any idea who might have wanted to harm Jeremiah? Not wanting to add to her stress, but really wanting an answer, and she shook her head, and her shoulders slumped, and she said, I don't know. Jeremiah was a hothead and burned a lot of bridges. I told him it would eventually come back to bite him, but he was young. He didn't really understand how small the cheer universe was and that he would get a reputation the way he was going. People wouldn't want to work with him no matter how good a choreographer he was. But he didn't listen. That was one of the several reasons we stopped talking, and I pondered that information because I hadn't seen a single negative thing about him in my Google search, and hearing Charlene say that he was difficult to work with, or a diva, as some would call it, was surprising and certainly opened the suspect pool. And in the short time he'd worked with our team, I hadn't seen any behavior from him that would indicate he was difficult, and Diane said, that's interesting. I've only heard good things about him, and Martha was pumped that she could hire him away from the Kindville Cougars, and Charlene said, well, she should have done more due diligence. They let him go from the Kindville Cougars. The owners decided he wasn't worth the trouble. And Diane and I looked at each other, and her look of confusion, I'm sure, mirrored my own. And then we turned our focus back to Charlene as she continued, and she said, I told you he was a hothead. He would manage his temper for a while and people would think he was amazing, and then he would just lose it. Normally, he lost his cool with other coaches, or even the owner. But he yelled at the girls one day at practice and Beverly had enough and fired him on the spot. And Diane said, wow, I wonder if Martha knew they fired him. Cheer really is a small world, so it's hard to believe she didn't. And I said that. And couldn't help but wonder if maybe his knowing Evelyn from college gave him a leg up. And Charlene said, well, he was fired from his job before he came to the Kindville Cougars too, and Beverly totally knew it, but was willing to give him a chance because he was extremely talented. And that made sense, because many people were willing to put up with a lot from coaches or other staff if it meant their teams would benefit. But I was more than a little horrified that he had yelled at some of the girls so badly Beverly had felt it necessary to fire him. And I wouldn't go so far as to say I was glad he was dead before he yelled at our girls. But I was glad things didn't get to that point, and I had to draw a line somewhere when it came to tough love, because constructive criticism was fine, but inappropriate yelling and screaming was not, and Diane said, that's just horrible that it happened at your gym, Charlene. And then she paused and bit her lip in a way that made it clear she was thinking something, and she said, how are you, though? I know things were over between you two a while ago, but it still can't be easy. And Charlene said, it is surreal, especially because I hadn't talked to him in a little over a year. Then, out of the blue, last week he called. I didn't respond or pick up. And the next day he texted and said he had a really important question and wanted me to please pick up. But I didn't, because I just didn't want to get sucked back into that relationship. After 4 more phone calls, he left what he had to say in a voicemail, and that got my attention, and I asked, what did his voicemail say? And Charlene said that if anything happened to him to call this number. And she pulled a scrap of paper out of her purse sitting on the table, and the number had a Chicago prefix, which I thought was where he lived before coming to coach the Kindville Cougars, and I asked, did you call it? And she shook her head and said, no. Part of me is afraid to, and part of me doesn't want to be involved in whatever he was clearly involved in. And I thought for a second and said, may I have it? And she said, sure, and shrugged. And as I fingered the scrap of paper, turning it over as if that would provide some clue, I couldn't wait to get back to the privacy of my room and call this mystery number, and I also needed to call Anthony and tell him I had this information. Chapter 10. When I reached my room, I sent a text to Ashley just to check in. And after she responded and gave me her status update, I sat down at the desk, and I fished the slip of paper out of my purse, spreading it out in front of me so I could see the numbers, and I picked up my cell phone and dialed, all the while trying to think of what I would say to the person on the other end of the line and feeling guilty I hadn't turned this over to Anthony right away. And my heart pounded as the phone rang, and just when I thought it would probably go to voicemail, someone answered. And out of breath, the man said, hello? And I said, hi, stammering, caught a bit off guard. I got your number from Jeremiah Oslo, figuring there was no reason to lie. And he said, oh? Warily, and I couldn't say I blamed him for being suspicious, and I said, my name is Abby Winters, and I knew him because he was the choreographer for my daughter's cheer team. And he said, listen, lady, I don't know what kind of information you think you were going to get from me, but Jeremiah was my friend, and I'm not about to say anything. I don't even know you. And I got the sense he was about to hang up, so I knew I needed to give him something compelling enough to keep his interest, and I said, he told Charlene to call this number if he turned up dead. I'm not Charlene, but she gave me the number. I'm just trying to make sure justice is served. And I heard a sharp intake of breath, and he said, Jeremiah's dead? And I said, you didn't know? And he said, no, I didn't, with a big sigh. And I felt terrible for breaking this news, and I said, I'm so sorry for your loss. It didn't occur to me you didn't know. And he said, what happened? And I explained to him what I knew, and then again how I came to have his phone number, and I said, do you have any idea why he would have given your number to Charlene and told her to talk to you? And there was silence on the other end of the line, and at first I thought he was still reeling from the news that his friend was dead. But then I wondered if he was stalling because he knew exactly why Jeremiah gave Charlene his number, but didn't want to tell me, and I said, "May I ask your name, by the way?" Knowing I should have already asked it, because if he hung up on me, at least I would have a name to go on. And Charlene hadn't told the police about the number, and once I got off the phone, Anthony was going to be my next call, and he said, "Sorry, I forgot my manners. Daniel Boynton." And I said, "Well, Daniel, do you know why he would have given your number to Charlene?" And he said, "I can't say for sure, but I have a pretty good idea." And I waited again, as there was silence on the line, hoping I wouldn't have to ask a third time, because I didn't like being pushy, but if I had to, I would. And he said, "Why should I tell you? I don't mean that the way it sounded. I just don't understand why you called instead of Charlene. Though to be honest, I would have been just as surprised had the call come from her." And I said, "That's a fair question. If you were Jeremiah's friend, then you knew he had a thing with Charlene for a while." And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, she didn't want to get dragged back into the mud again, and she's already been under pressure because of the media coverage, so I told her I would call." And he said, he really cared about her, in an offhand way, and I said, "Did he?" And he said, "Jeremiah had a thing for older women, especially older women with money, which I'm sure you know is fairly plentiful in the cheer world." And I was a little offended by that comment, because there were plenty of us cheer moms who weren't wealthy. But if Charlene was, and if those were the women Jeremiah went after, I could see how his friend would think that. And I said, "You mean Charlene wasn't the first cheer mom he dated?" And Daniel gave a snort and said, "Not hardly." And after we hung up the phone, I sat there in a daze because I hadn't been prepared for what he told me. Chapter 11. I just kind of sat there for a minute and tried to process what he had told me, and I couldn't believe that Charlene would risk her marriage and family. But things like this happened all the time, and I knew, regardless of how I felt about it, that I needed to tell Anthony what I had learned, and I picked my phone back up and dialed him, and he answered on the first ring, and he said, "I was just thinking about you," with a chuckle, and I said, "I hope you're thinking good thoughts," and laughed along with him, and he said, "Of course. I was just about to call you anyway and check in to see how Ashley was doing," and I said, "I think she's okay right now. I mean, as well as can be expected. She's sticking close to her friends," and he said, "That's good to hear," and I asked, "How is the investigation coming along?" And he said, "Not much new to report," and sighed, and said, "From everyone we've talked to here in Cherry City and from Kinville, where he worked before, people loved him. Though some may have loved him too much," and I said, "What do you mean by that?" And he said, "He seemed to be a ladies' man." And don't even ask. That's all I'm going to say. And I said, "Maybe he went after someone's girlfriend or wife." And he said, "Maybe," casually, and I wanted to push for him to tell me, but I knew he wouldn't, and it didn't surprise me that Anthony had heard the same information I had, and I said, "That's the same information I got. Until today." And even though Anthony and I were on the phone, I heard the slight squeak of his chair as he immediately sat up, and I could picture him maintaining that stiff posture, as it was one he always adopted when he was serious, and I had noticed it in our time together and often made fun of him, and I ran through everything I had just learned from Daniel until I finally dropped the bombshell, and I said, "He said Jeremiah would pursue these relationships to blackmail women for money. That seems like a big motive for murder, don't you think?" And I could hear Anthony breathing on the other end of the line, but no words being spoken, and I knew him well enough by now to know it was best to give him a minute to process, though he could be silent on the other end because it annoyed him I was investigating on my own, and that was always a possibility, a strong one, and when I almost couldn't take it anymore, he started talking, and he said, "I wish I could tell you to stay out of things and have you actually listen." And I said, "It's not like I'm in any danger. I called the phone number of someone in Chicago," and he said, "I'm assuming it's a cell phone, since that's what everyone has these days, so who knows where he's located." And that made me pause, and not that I felt I was in any danger, But he had a point, and 30 years ago, you could call someone and you knew they were at home because a cord attached from the phone to the wall, and he said, "But it's fine. I know it's futile to try to stop you. I do appreciate that you told me, and this wasn't information we already had, which I will tell you, and you don't need to repeat it, doesn't make me very happy. I talked to Charlene, and she never once mentioned any of that." And I thought about that, wondering why Charlene had kept it secret, though I was pretty sure I could guess why, and I wasn't even going to try to give her an excuse, and what I didn't understand was why she thought the police wouldn't find out she had an affair with Jeremiah, because it was already making the rounds on some news outlets, and I said, "I just wonder if one of these women that Jeremiah supposedly had a relationship with got upset enough to harm him." And he said, "Charlene had an alibi, and we haven't come across any other women around here that he was connected with. We only have witnesses saying they saw Jeremiah having dinner with Martha." And I said, "As in the owner of the Cherry City Aces?" And he said one and the same. But he worked for her, so it's not a shock they might have gone to have a bite of Mexican food to talk shop. And Anthony had a point. And although in all the years Ashley had been going to the gym, I'd never known Martha to take any coach or choreographer out to dinner, and I had taken my employees out before to show them my appreciation. And I certainly couldn't see Martha and Jeremiah having an affair, and Martha wasn't married, but she was in her 50s, and even without the age difference, she didn't seem the type to date someone who worked for her. And I said, "Are you going to check out this Daniel guy?" And he said, "Well, yes, now that I have this information." And I said, "Will you let me know what you find out?" And he said, "Maybe." And I said, "Maybe." And he started laughing and said, "Some things I do have to keep to myself, you know?" And I said, "I get it." And he said, "Now stay safe and try to stay out of trouble." And I said, "I will. Talk to you later." And we got off the phone, and I sat drumming my fingers on the table, and I kind of hated to do it on a competition weekend, as I knew how busy Martha was, but I wanted to ask her about going out to eat with Jeremiah because she might be the one who knew if anyone had issues with him. Chapter 12. I am shocked, but I guess not totally surprised to hear that Jeremiah made it a habit of seeking out cheer moms, Diane said, as all the cheer moms sat down at the coffee shop, getting our caffeine fix. And the girls competed in a couple hours, but were already dressed in their uniforms and with the team, warming up. And we had all met as we usually did, and I caught the ladies up on what I had heard from Daniel. And Stephanie asked, cradling her coffee close, "What was Charlene thinking, Diane?" And Diane sat up straight in her chair as disquiet circled the group and said, "What do you mean?" And Stephanie said, with a confused look on her face, "What do you mean? What do I mean? Why would Charlene risk her marriage over a fling with a cheer choreographer many, many years younger than her? She had to know it wouldn't be some long-lasting relationship, and while I had the same thoughts running through my head, I hadn't voiced them because it seemed like Charlene had already paid dearly for her sins. And Diane bristled just a little, her lips puckering and shoulders squaring, and I didn't blame her because she didn't know Charlene that well. Not well enough to know her motivations anyway. And Diane said, "I don't know what she was thinking. Maybe her marriage wasn't perfect before Jeremiah ever entered the picture. And if you want my opinion, and obviously you do, or you wouldn't have asked," he preyed on Charlene. "He knew she was in a vulnerable state, and I think he took advantage." And the other two ladies' eyes went wide, and their mouths slackened. And I had to admit I would hope that with age came wisdom. But if a 20-something could prey on a 40-something, then I knew that wasn't always realistically the case. And Stephanie said, "Come on, Diane, what makes you think he took advantage of her?" And Diane frowned, glancing around the table as if to gauge whether we would understand or not, and said, "Now this is all gossip, and at the time I didn't pay a lot of attention to it, but Charlene and her husband were going through a rough patch. She had caught him having an affair with his secretary. The oldest cliche in the book. Her daughter knew there was trouble at home, and she was upset over it. Charlene pulled Jeremiah aside and told him the story, asking him to take it easy on her in practice. It was soon after that he started texting Charlene just to, check in with her," Diane said, using finger quotes, and Stephanie said, "Yeah, but how did it go from there to an affair? And Diane narrowed her eyes at Stephanie, obviously tired of her interruptions, and said, "I'm getting to that." He started by texting her to check in and then asked her for coffee. He told her all the right things, and next thing she knew, she had a very poor lapse in judgment. And Stephanie said, "I don't know, Diane. Do you really think Charlene was that hard up for attention?" And Diane said, "I do. Because not only did they spend time together and then had an affair, but she was paying his bills, at least some of them." And the shock hit me in the face like hot coffee, and I said, "What?" And Diane nodded and said, "Yep, Evie told me. She also told me she told Charlene he was using her for money and to stop giving it to him." And Stephanie said, rolling her eyes, and then taking a sip of her coffee, "And she clearly didn't listen." And Diane said, "No, she didn't." Evie said she got so angry they didn't talk for a couple months. She finally broke it off because she came to the same realization. But by that time, she realized that her husband had found out and everything was out in the open. And Jenny said, "Then maybe one woman he conned killed him, or her husband." And I said, "They certainly would have motive, but other than Charlene, I'm not sure who those women were." And Stephanie said, "That's horrible. Now I feel bad for being unsympathetic." And Diane said, "Don't be. Until he was murdered and everything came out, I really think Charlene had worked through most of the hurt." And I said, "Do you think she might know of anyone else that he dated before her?" Feeling weird about using the word dated. And Diane said, "I don't know." And I thought about that for a second, and it might be worth asking Charlene, considering Jeremiah was murdered. And in any case, I filed that at the back of my mind for later and changed the topic, and I asked, "Have any of you ever heard of Martha taking any of the coaches or staff out for dinner one-on-one?" And Diane said, "No. Why would she do that?" And I said, "Well, sometimes I treat my staff to pizza or subs or something," unsure how to ask what I really wanted to know. And Diane said, "But your entire staff, right?" And I nodded, and Stephanie said, "I think a one-on-one outing, especially because everyone that works for her is so young, just seems, I don't know, like something she wouldn't do." And Diane asked, "Why, did someone see them together?" And I said, "Yes, but don't say anything. I don't want her to get spooked if she hears people saw them together. I want to ask her, but I know competition time is so stressful. I'm not sure I should." And Diane said, "I would. Her employee died, so I think any questions you might ask to find out who did it, she should answer." And the other two ladies nodded in agreement, and I said, "You're right. I should ask her. I guess I know where to find her, too." And I took a sip of my coffee, recalling that I should also make time to talk to Charlene again. Chapter 13. I felt a little nervous about bothering Martha in the middle of the competition, and I had been a cheer mom long enough to know that pestering the woman who ran a top gym was a bad idea on competition days, but still, I needed answers, and I thought maybe Martha had them. And after I found Ashley and made sure she was still doing okay, I asked her where I could find Martha, and she told me that because Martha watched all the teams work out, she would be in the practice room, and then Ashley warned me that Martha had been on a tear, picking apart every little thing, and I made my way to room 211, which was the Cherry City Aces practice room, and poked my head in. And I saw Martha standing next to a practice coach as they watched one of the younger teams run through their routine, and the sight made me nostalgic for the years when Ashley was little and stuck to my side. And I wasn't about to interrupt in the middle of a routine, but decided to stand inside the door and wait until a more appropriate time. And I didn't have to wait long as the team finished the routine, took the feedback from the coaches, and Martha let them get a drink. And she noticed me standing by the wall and motioned for me to come over, and she said, "Abby, is anything wrong?" And it didn't surprise me she would ask me this since I rarely sought her out, and I said, "No, Ashley is fine. I just hoped you might have a minute to chat." And a puzzled expression crossed Martha's face, and she said, "Of course. It's about time I took a break anyway." And I got right to business, knowing she wouldn't have more than a minute, and I said, "I know this is a horrible time to be bringing this up, but I was wondering if you can think of anyone who might have disliked Jeremiah." And an odd expression flitted across Martha's face. but I wasn't exactly sure what it meant, and she said, "Why are you asking?" And I said, "I know it probably seems like I'm being very nosy, but this really hit close to home, and I'm curious about what happened." And she said, "Aren't you dating the detective?" And her eyebrows rose and she tilted her head to look down at me, and now it was my turn to be confused, because what did it matter whom I was dating? And I got the feeling she didn't want to answer my questions, which made little sense. And I said, "Yes, Detective Anthony Barrett, but trust me, I'm not doing this on his behalf," forcing a laugh and trying to loosen her up a little. And I said, "He wouldn't be too pleased to know I was asking questions," and she just kind of shook her head back and forth. And a few more seconds went by before she spoke, and she said, "None that I know of. I'm just as shocked as you are at what happened. I'm mortified that something like this happened at my gym and to such a nice guy." And I said, "Was he? A nice guy, I mean." And Martha frowned and said, "Yeah, just as nice as any of my other coaches. Do you think someone at the gym did something to him?" And her voice took on a sharp tone, and I said, "Oh no, not at all. I just heard, you know how gossip runs around, that he wasn't always easy to get along with. I also heard he liked to date cheer moms." And I just threw that out there, trying to make it seem very nonchalant, but it definitely got a reaction out of her, and her body tensed and her eyes widened with surprise, and I wasn't sure if she was more shocked at the gossip about him being rude or dating cheer moms, and she said, "I don't know what to tell you. I didn't witness any of that." And I said, "Really?" And her eyes narrowed and she said, "Yes, really. What you getting at?" And I said, "Well, I know for a fact he dated Charlene Whitaker, a Kineville Cougars mom, for a while. I guess I find it odd you wouldn't have heard that. Did you ask the gym owner why he left the Kineville Cougars?" And she said, "Listen, good choreographers are scarce, so I can deal with a little drama. As far as his personal life and who he dated, I wouldn't know." And I got the distinct impression she was lying. The way her gaze wouldn't meet mine, and her attitude made me a little fearful of asking her about going out to eat with him, but I realized at this point she was already getting mad, so what did it matter? And she said, "If that's all, I really need to get back to work," and started to walk away, and I said, "One more thing, Martha." And she stopped and looked back at me, and I said, "Someone saw you two at the Mexican restaurant eating dinner the week before he died. What was that all about?" And she opened her mouth to answer, but the coach yelled to get her attention, and she said, "I have to go," and walked away from me. I didn't know what she had been about to say, but her hands were trembling a little, so something had rattled her, and I knew she'd had dinner with Jeremiah, just the two of them, which told me it wasn't just a thank you for being a good coach dinner, so what was it? Chapter 14. I left the practice room convinced Martha wasn't being completely honest with me, and the only people who I knew could shed some light on this whole situation were Charlene and Daniel. And I knew Charlene was reluctant to talk, but I thought maybe if I appealed to her again, telling her I felt Martha wasn't being quite truthful, maybe she would open up, and I stepped to the side of the hallway to avoid being in the way to call Charlene. And I dialed her number, and I crossed my fingers that she might be willing to talk, and she answered, "Hello." And I could hear caution in her voice, and I said, "Charlene, it's Abby. I hate to bug you about this again, but is there any way you would talk to me about Jeremiah?" And I heard her sigh on the other end of the phone, and I crossed my fingers that I wouldn't also hear the proverbial dial tone as she hung up on me, and she said, "I told you I don't know who could have killed him." And I said, "Maybe you know more than you think. I talked to a guy named Daniel." And she interrupted me and said, "Daniel, how did you talk to him?" And I said, "That's who answered the phone when I called the number you gave me, the one Jeremiah left you." And she said, "Oh," and I said, "You know Daniel, right?" And she said softly, "A little." And I said, "See, you already know more than you think. 15 minutes is all I ask." "Please," and she said, "Fine. Right now I'm in my room. My daughter's at practice, so come up." And Charlene gave me her room number, and we hung up. And I took off at a brisk pace to get to the elevator bank in the hotel lobby, and just a few minutes later I knocked on Charlene's door, and she said, "Come on in," when she opened the door, and I followed her into the room, and she motioned for me to have a seat at the little table and sat opposite me on the bed. drawing her legs up and folding them under her, and I said, I really am sorry, Charlene, to keep bothering you, but I'm sure you know how unsettling it is that someone who coached my daughter is dead. And she nodded, and I knew she understood how I felt, since at the beginning of the season her daughter's coach had been murdered, and she said, I get it. And I'm not upset with you, just upset with myself. And I said, why? And she said, because it brings back memories of how stupid I was. And I got up, sat next to her, and patted her hand to reassure her, and I said, you're not stupid. We all make mistakes. And she said dejectedly, I guess. What did Daniel say? Starting the conversation, and I said, he basically told me Jeremiah was a con man, that he would date cheer moms he knew had money and then blackmail them for money to keep the relationship quiet. And I hated having to say that, as I could see Charlene wincing at almost every word, and she said, well, I guess it's nice to know I'm not the only one out there, and tried a small smile, and I said, Charlene, it shows that he was very good at reeling people in. He preyed on women, and she said, at my age, I should have known better than to think someone so young would be interested in me, and I said, that's crazy, you're gorgeous. This isn't about you, it's about him and what a jerk he was. I just don't know if he was enough of a jerk that someone would kill him over it. And she said, I admit I was mad enough to think about it, but I never would, and I said, when did you meet Daniel? And Charlene bit her lip, closed her eyes for a second, and then opened them and said, he came down to visit Jeremiah a few times. Jeremiah had other friends visit a couple times too, but he only ever let me meet Daniel. And I said, do you know why? And she shook her head and said, no, and I didn't ask. Obviously, we were sneaking around, and I didn't want to be seen with him in public, so I couldn't very well ask him why he didn't want his friends to see him with me. And that made sense. And I felt bad for her that she had needed attention so badly that she had gotten caught up in Jeremiah's scheme. And I said, why do you think Jeremiah told you to call Daniel if anything happened? And she said, I do not know. What did Daniel say when you called him? And I said, he didn't know either. Are you sure you don't know of anyone else that he might have dated? And she said, no. I mean, I know there was someone back in Chicago, but I didn't even ask. There was someone his own age. I was blissfully in denial. And I said, one more question and I'll get out of your hair. Did he have a good relationship with the owner of the Kinville Cougars? And she said, not really. Honestly, I don't think she liked him much, but he was good at what he did, so it was worth dealing with his attitude. Of course, until his attitude became too much. And I said, thanks, Charlene. And she said, for what? It's not like I was very helpful. And I said, I don't know. Maybe you were. We'll see. And I was getting nowhere. And I needed to talk to someone who knew Martha well so I could figure out what she was hiding, which would have to wait until after the girls competed, and I was running late after speaking with Charlene and had to jog the whole way to the convention center performance space. Chapter 15. After the girls had their performance, which they did much better with than the Friday routine, the girls asked if we all wanted to go to dinner, the moms and the team, and they had apparently been eyeing the Mexican restaurant we had eaten at yesterday. And I definitely wasn't one to say no to Mexican 2 days in a row or spending time with my daughter, and since it was a huge group of people, I never had the chance to get Diane alone, and she had left early, saying she had a headache and was going to go to bed. So I didn't want to bother her, and after dinner, Ashley was off with her friends, so I decided to go back to my room where I put on my comfy pajamas and grabbed my laptop. Crawling into bed, and I flipped through the stations, finding the Hallmark Channel, and left a movie on in the background while I took my sleuthing in the internet direction. And I had already looked at articles and done a basic Google search, but I hadn't really done a thorough analysis of Jeremiah's social media, which really should have been my first thought. And at his age, he probably spent a lot of time on social media, and while he needed to be secretive, maybe something would jump out at me now that I had a few clues, and it was just too bad that the apps these kids were on these days, like Snapchat, weren't something you could cyberstalk easily, since most of those posts disappeared after a day, and instead, I went to Instagram, where I could look at his history, and I easily found his feed and was initially saddened by a bunch of people who had commented on his last post before he died, which looked to be a selfie as he walked into the gym. And there were over 200 comments, and I got sucked into reading what people had to say, and I felt awful because a lot of the comments were by cheerleaders he'd coached. And regardless of what Jeremiah may have done in his personal life, it looked like he had touched a lot of people through cheer. And I kept scrolling down, just about to close that post and scroll to the rest of his feed when something jumped out at me and it said, Pom Pom 76. I guess you finally got what you deserved, and I took a quick screenshot, and then I clicked on the username, and it opened up to a profile that didn't have any identifying information, with an avatar of a generic cheerleader and only one picture posted, which was a random quote that said, "No one rises to low expectations." And I put down my phone for a second to think, and then went back to the comments to see that people had piled on that negative poster as I would have expected, but no names were mentioned, and several people demanded the person not be a coward and come out and identify themselves. And I didn't disagree with comments saying it was awfully convenient to say hateful things to someone who was dead and couldn't defend themselves, and it was a kind of crappy thing. But what it told me was that someone was furious at Jeremiah, and I went to the search bar and typed Charlene's name, and I didn't follow her on Instagram, but her profile quickly came up, and I briefly scrolled through it to see nothing but pictures of her kids and flowers. And it was pointless looking at it, since it wasn't like she would have said, "Hey, go follow this fake profile I made for saying evil things." And I quickly texted Ashley, "Do you know anyone with this Instagram handle, pompom76? And I watched as the 3 dots came up on the screen revealing Ashley was typing, and she responded, "No? Why?" And I said, "No reason." And I went to Snapchat and then did a TikTok search for the same screen name, and getting nothing, I leaned back against the pillows and crossed my arms to consider my options. And I wondered where else I could cross-reference the username, and I decided to give Anthony a call. And I looked at the time and found it was a little after 10, so I knew he'd still be up, and I tapped on his name in my contacts, and he answered on the second ring, and he said, "What's up? You guys have a good time? How did Ashley do tonight?" And I said, "She and the whole team did great. Ashley is hanging out with her friends now, and I'm sitting here in my hotel room." And he said, "Uh-oh." And I said, "What do you mean, uh-oh?" Joking, knowing exactly what he meant. And he said, "I mean, oh, because if you're just sitting in your room, then who knows what things are hatching in that pretty little head of yours." And I couldn't help but smile, even if I didn't really like the pretty little head comment, and I couldn't deny I had been sitting there hatching plans. And I said, "You caught me. I was looking at Jeremiah's Instagram and saw a really hateful comment on there." And I told him what I had found and also talked to him about my conversation with Martha. And he said, "I'm going to say this just because I need to, but you really should leave this for the professionals. Though with my PSA out of the way, you may have found something important. We've looked at his social media the day after he died, but saw nothing negative." And I put the phone on speaker so I could go back to my photos, and I sent the screenshot I took to Anthony. And I said, "It looks like they posted it yesterday." And he said, "Now that's why we didn't see it." And I said, "You guys run across anyone with that username?" And he said, "Sorry, but no." Before you ask, we talked to Martha, but she was at the gym all day before he got there, and we're fairly certain that the poison got in his drink at his apartment. And I leaned back on the pillows and sighed, and I didn't want Martha to be guilty, but it also sounded like she was a dead end. And I said, "She may not have killed him, but she's hiding something." And he said, "Well, she could hide all she wants, because as long as she didn't kill him, it doesn't matter." And I said, "You're no help," and laughed. And he said, "Listen, the Instagram stuff, I appreciate. Just don't take my appreciation as license to do more investigating." And I said, Yeah. And we chatted for a few more minutes. And then after we hung up, I got on Facebook and looked at Martha's page. And she was married. I had met her husband several times, and her Facebook page was filled with pictures of her family and cheer events. And maybe my imagination was working overtime, and Martha was just annoyed because someone in a competition was asking questions about something which I was sure she'd rather forget. Chapter 16. "Can you believe it?" Stephanie said as we all stood outside the practice room watching our girls warm up, and she said, "The last competition of the season is finally here." And I said, "I know. I look forward to it, and it's also always a little sad at the same time. Though this year I had to admit I was more than glad to have it over with after all the craziness that had happened, and I wasn't sure I could take another event and was ready to firmly put the season behind us. And Diane said, chuckling, I know there are mixed emotions, but tryouts are in a month. And before we know it, we'll be right back at the beginning of a new season. And the rest of us just shook our heads. And I said, do you feel better this morning, Diane? And she said, much better. I think I just had a random migraine, but a good night's sleep was all I needed. And I said, good. I have a question for you. And started to tell her about my conversation with Charlene. And suddenly a scream interrupted me, and we all whipped our heads in the direction of the practice room where the sound had come from. And it only took a second before we all rushed into the room and saw the team huddled around Ashley with her coach and Martha's arms around her, and my heart leapt out of my chest as I ran over to my daughter and I said, are you okay, honey? Putting my hands on her biceps and looking at her up and down, trying to see where she had hurt herself, and she said, Mom, I'm fine. I didn't get hurt, stumbling over her words, and she said, but I got this, and handed me a piece of paper that had the hotel logo and name on it, and the message was written in block letters with blue ballpoint pen, and it said, tell your mother to bud out or Jeremiah won't be the last casualty of the season. And I could feel the blood drain from my face, and suddenly I saw spots. So I took a deep breath through my nose and exhaled through my mouth, a breathing technique I had learned in yoga. And someone had threatened my daughter and me because of my actions, and I said, honey, I am so sorry. And Ashley shook her head and said, Mom, it's just some crackpot, trying to blow it off. But her lower lip was quivering, and it bothered her more than she wanted to admit. And I said, I'm going to call Anthony, and reached for my phone. And Martha said, I already called 911. And I nodded, but I still wanted to call Anthony directly. And he answered, and I blurted out what had happened. And he said he was on his way. And we stood huddled around in a circle, me continuing to hug Ashley and rub her arm absent-mindedly to the point where she pulled away. And the action had been just as much for my comfort as hers. And finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the police arrived, and Anthony was only a few minutes behind them, and he said, walk me through everything up to the point where you got this note, Ashley. And she said, I got ready this morning in our room where my cheer bag has been since last night when we finished competing. I brought it to the practice room with me, but I didn't open it when we got here until we had a break. I went to get some snacks, and this paper was sitting on top of my stuff as soon as I opened the zipper pouch. And it only took a second to process what Ashley said and for it to dawn on me that someone had to have put the note in her bag when it was in the practice room. And that thought made me shake even more. But I knew I needed to stay calm for Ashley, even though it was hard, because this person was in the same room as my daughter at some point that morning. And Anthony asked, when you got here, did you see anyone you don't know or recognize? And Ashley shook her head and he said, what about you two? You see anyone in here? To the coach and Martha, who both shook their heads, and he said, we will keep officers here until you've performed and you guys leave the convention center. And I said, perform? There is no way these girls can go on after this. And Ashley looked at me in horror and said, Mom, I am competing. There is no way I will let someone scare me off at this point. Some other cheerleader probably thought it would be funny to put this in my bag. And I said, I don't know, Ashley. And she said, Mom, you always say the best way to combat bullies is to not let them deter you. And I said, yeah, but I meant actual schoolyard bullies, not someone who can hurt you or worse. And Anthony said, I don't know if it will make you feel any better, Abby, and all of you, but the girls won't be alone for the rest of their time at the competition. I can assure you they will all be safe. And I knew when I was beat and said, okay, but I'm not leaving and I'm not taking my eyes off you. And she said, okay, Mom, now let's get back to practice. And rallied the girls. And I looked at Diane and the other ladies and just shook my head, wondering what else could possibly happen. Chapter 17. I can't wait until the competition is over. We need to get out of here, I said, as the other moms and I leaned against the wall watching the girls practice. And Diane said, I can't believe they're all still so gung-ho to compete, especially Ashley, but look at her. She hasn't missed a beat. And she was right, and she was definitely stronger in many ways than me. And Stephanie said, I'm glad the trainer is making them take a lot of breaks. And Diane said, me too. The girls have had so much adrenaline running through their bodies. They need to make sure they don't overdo it, or they'll be spent before it's time to compete. And Anthony sat across the room talking to Martha, the coach, and the trainer, but as I watched him, he finally stood and made his way over to me, and he asked quietly, Are you okay? And I shook my head, trying to hold back tears. And part of me wanted him to hug me. And another part of me didn't want him to touch me because I was afraid if he did, I might just lose it. And I needed to stay strong for Ashley, and I said, Not okay, but I'm working on it. Trying to put on a brave face, and Diane said, Do you have any idea who could have done this, Abby? And I said, I wish I could say yes, but I don't have a clue. And Diane said, Whoever planted that note had to be someone who was already in this room or someone who somehow got to her bag yesterday. And I said, They couldn't have gotten her bag yesterday because her snacks were packed before she left our hotel room this morning. I'm the one that put them in there, and I know the note wasn't there. Are you sure it wasn't Martha? And the other three women spun their heads to look at me, and I hadn't had the chance to share with them my conversation with her. And Anthony said, I can't say with 100% certainty, but I would have to guess no. From what the girls told me, both Martha and the coach weren't anywhere near the bag. And Diane said, What makes you think Martha would threaten one of our girls? And I said, When I talked to her yesterday, she was hiding something. I don't know what she was hiding, but she wasn't being completely honest with me when I asked her about Jeremiah. And Anthony said in a quiet tone, But that doesn't mean she killed him or would do anything to hurt one of the girls. And the other ladies nodded their heads in agreement, and I didn't blame him because I didn't want to think it could be Martha either. And I said, But then, who could have poisoned Jeremiah by putting something in his water bottle and then be here at the competition, able to slip that note with no one noticing? Maybe Martha was having an affair with him. That would explain her being at his apartment and slipping poison into his bottle, and Anthony said, I know you want someone to be guilty, but she also has an alibi for that approximate time. She couldn't have been at his apartment in order to poison him, and Jenny said, Let's grab our things and head over to the competition floor, interrupting me, and Anthony said, There are 2 officers that will follow the girls everywhere they go until you guys are checked out and on your way home. And I smiled gratefully, because I felt safer with a police escort, and the girls lined up with one police officer in front and then another one after the last girl, with all the moms trailing behind them, and Stephanie said, I almost feel like we're lining up for preschool. And we all gave a nervous chuckle, and it was kind of like that. And I appreciated her trying to lighten the mood. And we headed to the competition floor along with our 2 police officers, and soon the girls peeled off behind the stage, followed by Martha, the coach, and the trainer. And I wanted to follow them, but knew it would mortify Ashley if I tried, and I trusted the police would keep them safe. And Anthony said, They're going to be okay. Knowing what was running through my head, and he said, Sanchez and Miller are 2 of our best and won't let anything happen to those girls. And our girls were on deck, and it seemed to take forever before we were called next. And I was more nervous than I had ever been for Ashley to perform because I knew how much rode on this performance. And for the girls' sake, I wanted them to do their best and win the championship that they had worked so hard for all year, and hopefully they would have an easier time putting that threat out of their minds than me. And the announcer called out, And now the Cherry City Aces can take the floor. And the girls burst from behind the curtain on the stage, screaming and cheering, doing backflips and getting the crowd hyped up before taking their places for the music to start. And Diane, Stephanie, Jenny, and I looked at each other and crossed our fingers, but we didn't need to worry, because the next 2 minutes and 30 seconds were sheer perfection. And I screamed, I don't think they've done that well all year. And the girls finished the routine, and as they said in cheer, they hit on every skill. And Anthony said, They were absolutely amazing, and gave me a hug. And then the moms and I, followed by Anthony, headed over to the area where the girls would come out. And a few minutes later, the coach came and got us, telling us that the officers didn't want the girls to leave through the crowded area and that we were going to go a different way backstage to meet them. And I ran over and gave Ashley an enormous hug, and she and her teammates cried with happiness. And Ashley said, "Martha said we did amazing." And I said, "You were amazing, sweetheart. That was the best routine you've done all year." We all agreed. And she jumped up and down and gave me another hug, and Martha said, "All right, ladies, we need to head back to the practice room until it's time for awards," and everyone fell in line, with the police escorting us back to the practice room. And once we were safely in the room, the girls busted out more snacks and sat relaxing while the moms and I chatted with Anthony, and Ashley called out, "Hey, Mom, can you come here a minute?" And I looked at the other moms and shrugged, because who knew what she wanted, but I headed over to the other side of the room where she sat with her friends, and she said, "Do you have any scissors on you?" And I said, "Scissors? No, I don't carry scissors in my purse. What do you need scissors for?" And she said, "My ankle was giving me trouble today, so the trainer taped it, but now it's starting to swell." And I thought, please let her not have injured her ankle again. But if she had, at least it was at the end of the season and she'd have plenty of time to heal. And I said, "I need scissors to cut off the tape," looking around for the trainer, and I said, "Hey, Martha, where's Evelyn?" And Martha looked around with a puzzled look on her face and said, "I don't know. She was with us backstage, but I haven't seen her since." And the coach said, craning her head to look around the room, "She didn't come back with us from the competition floor." And I yelled, "Anthony," and motioned for him to come over, an idea forming in my mind. Chapter 18. "What?" Anthony said when he reached us. "Are you okay?" He looked at Ashley and I said, "Do you have a knife on you to cut this tape off?" And he said, "Sure," with a puzzled expression on his face. And I leaned over as he started to carefully cut the tape and whispered in his ear, "It's Evelyn, the trainer." And he said, "Who were you talking about? What about a trainer?" And I said, "That's who murdered Jeremiah. It's the only thing that makes sense." And he said, "Their coach and Martha had the same access to that bag today." And I said, "I know, but I don't think it was either of them." When the coach just said the trainer never came back from the competition stage, for some reason, I remembered the trainer started working at the Cherry City Aces at the same time Jeremiah did, and she also used to work for the Kineville Cougars. What if she had a thing for Jeremiah, but he was only interested in an older woman with money? Maybe she killed him to get back at him. And he said, "But didn't she give him CPR at the scene?" And I said, "Yeah, but maybe she was just doing it to make it look like she was trying to revive him." And he said, "Honey, I hate to say this, but I think you're reaching. You've had a very traumatic day." And I said, "I get what you're saying, but that's not it." And he said, "Well, it does seem suspicious that she didn't come back from the competition floor with the rest of the team. I'll send an officer to look for her." And Anthony went over to the door where the two officers stood waiting, and something dawned on me, and I said, "Hey, Martha," calling across the room and then walking over to meet her, and I said, "Do you have the full competition schedule?" And she said, "Yeah," and reached down, pulling some folded up papers out of her bag and said, "What do you want to look for?" And I said, "When did the Kineville Cougars compete?" And she said, "It looks like they're up in about 5 minutes," as she ran her finger down the list of names on the Kineville Cougars. And I ran back over to Anthony and said, "I know where she's at. She's watching the Kineville Cougars, and my bet is she wants to hurt Charlene or Charlene's daughter." And he said, "Stay here. We'll go check it out." And I shook my head vehemently and said, "I'm coming with you." And he said, "I don't have time to argue. You stay here right next to us," and left one officer at the door, and the other officer, Anthony, and I took off at a run back to the competition hall. And when we got there, I was panting, trying to catch my breath while looking around the room for Charlene or Evelyn. And I said, "Charlene will be in the parent pit, and if Evelyn is going to do something to her, it'll probably be there. Come on, follow me." And I went around to the far side so we could get into the fray, and we threaded our way around people as the Kineville Cougars team came out on stage and the music started. And I scanned the parents in the pit for Charlene, and suddenly I spotted her, and Evelyn was right behind her. And I grabbed Anthony's arm and pointed at what I saw, since there was no way he could hear me over the loud, pulsing music. And I yelled, "There she is," and took off. pushing my way up to the front to get to Charlene, and I wasn't watching the routine. I was watching Charlene and the trainer, and suddenly I saw Evelyn lift her hand, and there was a syringe in it, and she had her thumb on the plunger, and I reached for Charlene even though I wasn't close enough, and I screamed, "Charlene!" at the top of my lungs, trying to be heard over the deafening music, and Charlene looked over her shoulder and the trainer stopped and seemed to freeze for a moment before she saw me, Anthony, and the officer, and she sidestepped away from us and then took off. And Charlene said, "What in the world is going on, Abby?" And I stopped as I watched the officer and Anthony chase the trainer, and I said, "I'll tell you later. I hope your daughter does a great job," calling over my shoulder as I ran out of the parent pit to where I saw an officer handcuffing Evelyn, and Anthony said, "Head back to the practice room and I'll catch up, but I think we have our killer." Chapter 19. Finally, the moment we had been waiting for all season, to find out who won the championship, and the moms and I sat in the audience while our girls and all the other teams were up on stage, huddled in tight groups, holding hands and waiting for the announcer to call the winners. And the announcer started his spiel saying, "We'd like to thank our sponsors and everyone that made this cheer season possible." And Diane grumbled, "I wish you would just get to it already." And I wholeheartedly agreed, and Anthony had not come back to the practice room before we headed to the awards, and I was fairly confident we had nothing to worry about now, but still wanted to hear for sure from Anthony that the killer had been caught. And even though I was still just a little worried, I forced myself to pay attention to the announcer, because this was a big moment for Ashley and her team, and the announcer said, "And without further ado, in third place, the Twisters," and the team in third place jumped up and down and took their trophy. And I was fairly confident there was no way our team would have gotten third, so it was going to come down to second or first place. And the announcer said, "In second place, the Grovetown Wildcats," and they all rose as one, and we all started screaming, drowning out the announcer saying that the Cherry City Aces had won the championship. And as I watched my daughter and her team on stage accepting the Grand Champion Award, pride swelled in my heart, and not only had they worked really hard all season, but they had overcome a lot of obstacles to win. And the moms and I all hugged each other, and then we headed over to meet our girls as they came off stage. And I said, "Ashley, I'm so proud of you," hugging her, and the girls were all elated, screaming and yelling, and Anthony said from behind us, "What did I miss?" And Ashley said, "We won, Anthony. We won." And he gave her a high five. And I didn't really want to talk about it and ruin Ashley's moment, so I waited until she asked if she could go over to where one of her friends sat with her parents, and I said yes before I turned to Anthony, and I said, "I'm so proud of her, and I hope you're about to tell me you caught Jeremiah's killer." And he said, "I'm sorry I doubted you, but you were right." As soon as she knew we'd caught her red-handed, she spilled her guts. Apparently, she and Jeremiah were in on this scam together. They were both at the same gyms in Chicago where it started, and then moved to Kinville, and from there to the gym at Cherry City. And I said, "If they were in it together, what happened?" And he said, "Well, apparently, what was supposed to be a scheme to get money from these women changed when Jeremiah recently met someone. Instead of being their latest victim, he told the trainer they were done, and he was turning over a new leaf." And I said, "Martha, it was Martha, wasn't it?" And he nodded and said, "Yes. It appears that he and Martha started a relationship, and he was in love. The trainer didn't take too kindly to that." And I said, "Well, I'm glad I now know why Martha was acting so odd, and I feel bad if she cared about him like he cared about her." And he said, "Yeah, I would say that was the reason for any of her odd behavior." And I said, "Well, I'm just glad the season has come to a close, and that Ashley and her team have achieved everything they set out to." And he said, "I can't wait until next year's season," and I couldn't help but smile because I wasn't in any rush, but I liked the fact that it seemed like he had plans to tackle next year's season with me. And we would just hope it wouldn't be as eventful as this one, because I wasn't sure I could take another season like this one. The end. You have just listened to It's All About the Hit, a Cheer Mom's Cozy Mystery. Book 5. Written and narrated by Lena Turner.